My father looked me in the eyes without flinching and said the $64,000 my dying mother had built from life insurance checks and double shifts and birthday envelopes had been redirected, his word, redirected, to my stepbrother's business that did not survive a single year. He did not flinch. That is the part I keep coming back to, the part that lives in me like something with teeth. He looked directly at me across the kitchen table, my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike and sat outside every single one of my school plays in the front row and cried at my 8th grade graduation like I had just won a Nobel Prize, and he told me the money was gone. All of it? Redirected. His word, redirected. $64,000 that my mother had spent 11 years building from life insurance checks and double shifts and birthday envelopes from grandparents and the careful, grinding arithmetic of a woman who knew she was dying and wanted to make sure her daughter got to go to college anyway. $64,000 that my father had been the custodian of, that I had been told since I was 14 was mine, that had one job, get me out of our town and into a future my mother had not lived to see. Gone. Redirected. To Brandon. Brandon, who was 22 and had dropped out of 2 programs already and who my stepmother Diane referred to as finding himself, which was a phrase that apparently had a $64,000 price tag attached to it. My father looked at me and he did not flinch, and I understood in that moment that something had been decided about me, not that day, not in that conversation, but over a long period of time, quietly, in rooms I had not been in, and by the time he was telling me, the decision was so complete and so settled that there was nothing to negotiate. The table had been set without me and I had just arrived to find my chair removed. I was 17 years old. I am 23 now. I'm telling you this because I have spent 6 years being angry in ways that were not useful, and I am only recently becoming angry in ways that are, and the difference is clarity, and clarity requires telling the truth about every part of it, including the parts where I made it easier for them than I should have. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is important. My mother's name was Carol. She died of ovarian cancer 11 days after my 6th birthday. I remember her in the specific, fragmentary way you remember things from that age, smells and textures and the particular quality of her voice rather than full scenes, though there are a few full scenes that I have kept so carefully they have stayed sharp. She read to me every night. She had a laugh that surprised people who did not know her because it was bigger than she was. She called me her best work, which embarrassed me even at 6 but which I have thought about almost every day since she stopped being alive to say it. My father, whose name is Gerald and who I am going to call Gerald from this point forward because I find I no longer have a comfortable word for what he is to me, Gerald grieved in the way some men grieve, by filling the space as quickly as possible with something that felt like normalcy. He met Diane 14 months after my mother died. He married her 20 months after that. I was 9 years old at their wedding and I was a flower girl and I stood at the front of the room in a yellow dress that Diane had picked and I smiled in every photograph because Gerald had asked me to and I wanted to make him happy because making him happy was the only way I knew to feel safe. Diane had a son. Brandon was 4 years older than me, which made him 13 at the wedding. He was not cruel to me in the active sense. He was indifferent in a way that was its own kind of message, the message being that I was not a person who required his attention or his acknowledgement, that I existed in the same category as furniture he had not chosen and could not be bothered to move. He called me Gerald's kid when he referred to me to his friends. I heard him do it once when I was 11, and I did not say anything, and I think that was the first moment I understood that the rules in this house were not the same for both of us. Diane was smarter than Brandon. She understood that open hostility was inefficient. She was pleasant to me in a way that was constructed rather than felt, the way a building is constructed, with a specific purpose in mind. She asked about school. She attended my events when Gerald was attending them. She made my birthday dinners and put candles on the cake and took photographs, and the photographs looked like evidence of a warm family and were absolutely nothing of the kind. What she did instead of hostility was quieter and more effective. She worked on Gerald. That is the only way I know how to describe it. She worked on him the way water works on stone, consistently, over time, in a direction, until the shape of him changed and the change looked natural because it had happened so gradually. I noticed it in small ways first. Gerald started to mention Brandon's potential more. He started to talk about Brandon's challenges with a tenderness that had a slight edge of comparison in it, as if Brandon's difficulties were somehow more deserving of resources than my stability, as if struggling required more investment than succeeding. I was a good student. I had always been a good student, partly because I had inherited my mother's stubborn practicality and partly because school was the one place where I was evaluated on my own terms and I understood intuitively that it was the way out. My grades were consistent. I did not require interventions or tutors or special programs. I just worked and performed, and Gerald, I began to understand, had started to read my self-sufficiency as needlessness. I did not need the way Brandon needed. And needing, in that house, had become the primary metric for deserving. The college fund existed in the form of a specific account that my maternal grandmother had helped Gerald set up after my mother died, using the life insurance money as the foundation. Gerald was the custodian because I was 6 and someone had to be. My grandmother, who is still alive and who is one of the only people who comes out of this story without damage to their dignity, told me about the fund when I was 14. She explained exactly what it was and approximately how much was in it and what it was for, and she looked at me with a directness that I understand now she had earned through worry, and she said, "Your mother built that for you. Make sure you know it is there." I knew it was there. I checked on it once, when I was 15, asked Gerald about it in what I thought was a normal, practical conversation about college planning. He confirmed it existed, gave me a number that matched what my grandmother had described, and said we would sit down and go through the specifics when I was closer to applying. His tone was normal. His face was normal. I had no reason to suspect that by the time that sitting down happened the account would have a different shape. Diane's son Brandon had, by the time I was 16, accumulated a specific kind of record. He had started a business degree at a state school and left after one semester citing the environment not being right for him. He had enrolled in a culinary program and left after 4 months when the schedule conflicted with something he did not specify. He was, at 21, living in Gerald and Diane's house, working part-time at something adjacent to the fitness industry, and Diane had begun describing him in conversations as an entrepreneur between ventures, which was a phrase that required a significant amount of generosity to accept as accurate. Diane wanted to fund Brandon's next venture. That is the clean version of what happened. She wanted Gerald to give Brandon money to start a business, some kind of supplement or coaching company. The details changed depending on which conversation I accidentally overheard or which version Gerald told me later. The money she had access to through Gerald was not enough. Or it was not enough without consequence to their own financial stability. But there was another account. There was an account with $64,000 in it that was designated for a child who was self-sufficient and academically capable and who could, Diane had been constructing this argument for months, find other ways. Scholarships. Loans. Work study. Ways that other people use all the time and managed perfectly well with. I was other people, in this accounting. I was the child who could manage with less because I had demonstrated the capacity to manage. I found out the way I found out a lot of things in that house, by being somewhere I had not announced I would be. I came home from school early because a class had been cancelled and I let myself in quietly because I had earphones in, and was in my own head, and I heard voices in the kitchen before I made my presence known, and I stopped, the way you stop when you hear your own name in a conversation that does not know you are listening. Diane was saying my name in the context of a sentence about adaptability. About my demonstrated resilience. About how the experience of navigating financial reality would, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, build character. Gerald said something I could not fully hear. Diane said that Brandon's window for this opportunity was narrow and that my window for college was not, that I had time and options and that the fund had been built for my education and education could take many forms and many funding structures. Gerald said, and this part I heard clearly because he said it with the tone of someone who has been convinced and is now in the process of convincing himself, she is going to be okay. She has always been okay. I stood in the hallway of my own home and listened to my father decide that being okay was the same as not needing anything, and that not needing anything meant not deserving what had been set aside for me, and I understood with the specific, cold clarity of a 17-year-old who has spent years watching the furniture of her life quietly rearranged, that the decision had already been made and what I was hearing was the final coat of paint being applied. I walked back out the front door. I stood on the porch for a while. Then I walked to my grandmother's house, which was 12 minutes away, and I sat at her kitchen table and told her what I had heard. My grandmother's face did something I had not seen it do before. It went very still. Then she picked up her phone and called Gerald. That call was the beginning of the only real fight I ever witnessed Gerald have with Diane. I know this because he told me later, in the explanation conversation, the one where he sat me down and looked at me without flinching and used the word redirected. He said Diane had felt my grandmother's call was an intrusion. He said things had been complicated. He said the opportunity for Brandon was time-sensitive. He said he had looked into scholarship options for me and there were strong programs available and he was confident I would qualify. He said, "You have always landed on your feet." I looked at my father and I thought about my mother making double shift after double shift and signing paperwork while she was on chemotherapy and setting aside birthday envelope money from my grandparents so that I would have this specific thing when I needed it, and I thought about the word redirected, and I thought about Brandon's supplement company, and I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "I heard you in the kitchen. 2 weeks ago. I heard the whole conversation." Gerald looked at the table. I said, "I want you to know that I heard it. I want you to know that I know exactly what was said and exactly what was decided and exactly how it was decided. I am not going to pretend I did not hear it." He said, "It is more complicated then." I said, "I know it is more complicated." That is not what I said. I said I heard it. He did not finish his sentence. I did not help him. We sat in the silence of two people who have arrived at a place where the truth is fully present and there is no longer any useful pretending to be done about it, and the silence had a weight that I understood even at 17 would not lift easily or soon. I was right about that. I applied for every scholarship I could find. That is the practical part of the story, and I am going to tell it practically. My grandmother helped me. She sat with me at her kitchen table for 3 weekends in a row, her reading glasses on, my applications spread across every surface, and she helped me write essays and fill out forms and meet deadlines with the focused, furious efficiency of a woman who was doing this as an act of love and also, I understood, as an act of something that rhymed with revenge but was more dignified than that. She was 71 years old and she drove me to the library when the internet at her house was too slow, and she waited in the car and read her book and did not complain once. I got scholarships. Not $64,000 worth. But enough, combined with loans that I understood I was going to be paying back for a decade and a work-study program that covered my living expenses if I was careful, to get me to a university in a different state and into a program I had chosen and through 4 years that were hard in ways that were entirely worth it. I did not go home for the first Thanksgiving. I told Gerald I had work obligations, which was true and also convenient. He called. I answered because I was not ready yet to not answer. He asked how things were going. I said fine. He said he was proud of me. I said thank you in a voice that was perfectly level and communicated nothing additional, and he heard the nothing additional and said my name once in a way that was reaching for something, and I said I had to get back to work, and I did. Diane sent me a text that holiday weekend that said she hoped I was having a wonderful Thanksgiving and that they missed me at the table. I read it once. I did not respond. I have not responded to a text from Diane since the kitchen conversation. That is not a strategy and it is not a performance. It is simply the most accurate representation of what I have to say to her, which is nothing, and I have decided that honesty in this form is a reasonable way to conduct myself. Brandon's venture did not succeed. I want to be precise about this because I am not going to pretend I felt nothing when I found out. I found out from Gerald, who mentioned it in one of our careful, surface-level phone calls about 8 months after I had started university, slipping it in with the practiced casualness of someone who has been thinking about how to mention something for a while. He said Brandon was regrouping and exploring new directions. He said the business climate had been challenging. He said these things without saying the word that was underneath all of them, which was that $64,000 of my mother's careful, dying effort had been handed to a 22-year-old and had not survived contact with his regrouping. I said, I am sorry to hear that. I was not sorry. I am not going to say I was sorry. I'm going to say that I was not glad either, because a human being had failed at something and that is not a cause for celebration, but I was also not going to manufacture a grief I did not have for a loss that had been funded by a theft. I felt, if I am being precise, a kind of cold confirmation. The shape of what I had predicted had arrived in approximately the form I had predicted it, and that was not satisfying. It was just accurate. What happened to my relationship with Gerald is the longest and most complicated part of this, and I want to try to do it justice without making it simpler than it is. Gerald called more in my first year of university than I expected. He was trying. I could hear him trying in the specific register of a man who knows he has done damage and has not yet figured out the right way to address it and is hoping that consistent contact will eventually create an opening. I answered most of the calls. I was never warm in a way that was not earned, and I was never cold in a way that was not accurate. I was civil, which is a specific temperature, not hot and not cold but functional, and I maintained it because I was not ready to decide what more than civil was going to look like. He came to my university for family weekend in October of my first year. He came alone. I noticed he came alone and did not comment on it. We had dinner at a restaurant near campus and he ordered carefully and asked about my courses and met 2 of my friends and was charming with them in the way Gerald was always charming with people who were new to him, warm and attentive and genuinely interested, and I watched my friends respond to him and I thought about how long it had taken me to understand the difference between Gerald performing warmth and Gerald actually spending it. At the end of dinner he said he wanted to say something and he said it with the weight of something prepared, which it was. He said he knew what he had done. He said he knew it did not have a good explanation. He said Diane had been a strong influence and he had allowed that influence to override something he should not have allowed it to override, and that he was aware of the full implications of that sentence even as he said it. He did not say he was sorry. He said he was aware. Those are different things and I noted the difference. I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. I said, "When you told me I always landed on my feet. Did you actually believe that? Or was it something you said because it made what you were doing easier to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Both. And I am not proud of either one." That was the most honest thing he said to me in that entire dinner and possibly in years before it, and I sat with it and gave him credit for it even though credit was not the same as forgiveness and I was not offering forgiveness, which I told him directly when he asked, later in the conversation, whether there was a path to that. I said I did not know yet. I said I was not going to promise something I could not deliver. He nodded like that was fair. I thought it was fair too. My grandmother died in the spring of my second year. She had a stroke that was fast and she did not suffer long, and I was with her at the end because I had driven through the night when the hospital called and made it in time, and I held her hand and she knew I was there, and that is the part I am keeping and not giving back regardless of everything else. Her will left me a specific amount. Not enormous. Enough. She had been preparing it, I understood when I read the documents, for some time, which meant she had been thinking about me and about what I would need and about what had been taken, and she had done what she could do from her position, which was leave me something solid and direct and unconditional. Her lawyer, who had known her for decades, told me she had revised the document the week after the kitchen conversation. The week after Gerald's call. She had gone to her lawyer and made adjustments and said nothing to me about it. She did what she could do. She always did what she could do. That was who she was. I used part of the money to pay down loans. I used part of it to finish my degree without working 30 hours a week alongside it, which meant I slept more in my final 2 years and my grades reflected it. I graduated on a Saturday in May and Gerald came and Diane did not, and I had decided in advance to have no feelings about either fact and managed it reasonably well. Gerald stood with me for photographs after the ceremony and he looked proud in a way that was genuine and complicated because it was both real and insufficient, the way a lot of things about Gerald were both real and insufficient. Brandon, I have gathered from what Gerald mentions in his careful, surface-level way, is in a different city now. Working. Diane presents this as forward motion, apparently, and I have no information about whether it is or not and have not invested energy in forming an opinion. Diane and I have not spoken in 4 years in any form that counts as speaking. She texts on my birthday. I do not respond. I have decided that this is the boundary and that it is not cruel and not performative and not something I need to revisit. She took something from me that she had no right to take, and she took it through a person who should have protected it, and she experienced no consequence for either of those things, and the silence is the only consequence I have access to and I am using it. Gerald and I talk. That is the most accurate description of where we are. We talk. There is warmth in it sometimes, genuine warmth, because he is my father and the history is real, and I am not capable of reducing a person I have loved my entire life to a single decision, even when that decision was significant. But there is also a distance that was not there before, a careful distance I maintain not out of punishment but out of self-protection, because I have learned that access to me is not automatic, that it has to be built from something real, and Gerald and I are still in the process of determining what we are building and from what materials and whether what we are making will hold. He asked me once, recently, if I had forgiven him. I said I was still deciding what forgiveness meant in this specific situation and that I was not going to rush that process for either of our comfort. He said he thought that was fair. I said I thought so too. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I was standing on that porch having walked out of my own house at 17. People will tell you that you are capable of handling things as a way of deciding not to help you handle them. Being strong is a quality that gets used against you by people who want permission to withdraw. The fact that you can survive without something does not mean you were not owed it. Those two things are not the same, and do not let anyone construct a logic that says they are. My mother worked herself past the point of what was reasonable and saved $64,000 for me while she was dying and entrusted it to a man who entrusted it to a woman who converted it into a business that did not survive a year. I got my degree anyway. I have a career I built from scratch with my own hands and my grandmother's love and the stubbornness I inherited from a woman I barely got to know. I am not okay in the easy sense of the word, not the sense Gerald used when he said I always landed on my feet, but I am okay in the real sense, the sense that means I am standing and building and honest about what it cost. The sentence that stays with me, the one I heard in the hallway, the one that set the shape of the next 6 years, was not the sentence Gerald said to my face across the kitchen table. It was the one I heard him say before he knew I was listening. The one that was true because it was not performed for me. She is going to be okay. She has always been okay. He was right and he was wrong and he was both at the same time. I am okay. I have always found a way to be okay. And the reason I have always found a way to be okay is that my mother decided, from a hospital bed, that I would have what I needed to be okay, and she built it from nothing, and the people who were supposed to guard it did not, and I have been okay anyway, in the hard way, in the real way, in the way that costs something and knows exactly what it cost. She called me her best work. I'm trying, every day, to make sure that was still true even after everything that was supposed to help me do it got taken away. That is not a happy ending. It is just the one I have, and it is mine, and nobody redirected it.